I'll hand over to you, Heidi. You have the floor.
Thank you, Klaus, and thank you for SÜDWIND for convening this, I would say, workshop on sustainable finance and SDGs. And if sustainable finance indeed our angle to the, let's say, the scandalous lack of implementation of the SDGs at the moment, as the report says, only 12% are on track. So what could be done? And I would like to take you back to 2018 when the EU Commission published its first report on sustainable finance. And in this action plan, it was already mentioned that it would be impossible to invest sustainably unless the investors would have insight and transparency to the supply chains of the investee companies. And that was a little bit already the recognition that later there would be the directive on corporate sustainability due diligence and the corresponding reporting directive, corporate sustainability reporting directive. So I would say that those of us who had already started to think about how to move to a mandatory binding accountability for private sector on sustainability saw that there was a very good hook. And at the same time, we saw that the Fundamental Rights Agency of the EU had already started to think about how the most vulnerable people in the world, who often were also victims of abuses by companies, how they could get access to justice. So these were the two elements that in a way then I would say led the EU Commission in 2020 to announce that they would come forward with this proposal for mandatory, as we called it at that time, environment and human rights due diligence. So as for the SDGs, I think the report quite rightly points out that the SDGs barely feature in EU legislation. And the European Parliament has, in its latest annual report, also pointed out that there should be a situation where all policies of the EU should be subject to mandatory SDG check, and that it would be necessary in order to better understand and address any negative effects. So I would say that the implementation and attention to SDGs at EU level has not been satisfactory at all. And very often, which is also pointed out in the report, it has focused on the EU internal dimension. But then again, I think that what we now have is the adoption of the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, which is a direct consequence of the EU Green Deal's external dimension. So now the attention is very much also on the external dimension, which I think is corresponding to what the EU's responsibility of SDGs also should be. And while I'm reading from the report that SDG reporting very often only focuses on kind of positive impacts, is piecemeal. It does not address the deficiencies and adverse impacts. Again, I think this speaks very much in favor of having this mandatory tool. And as we all know, it's to as much as possible extent, it's derived from the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, and also the preceding, already then existing OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises, which, by the way, have been revised very recently. So now the question is that if indeed the situation is that we fully need to have the private sector involved in the implementation of SDGs. So let's say that my assumption is that this is not my final opinion, but I'm asking if perhaps at best the SDGs can help the companies to identify their material impacts on, let's say, focused on the 17 dimensions of sustainable development. And then if we combine that for European companies and companies operating in Europe, which is far more, if that could help them to identify the adverse impacts of their business on their operating environment, human rights and environmental adverse impacts. So I think I'm not suggesting in any way that SDGs would somehow have lost their glory and their importance, but I would say that the deficiency obviously has been that it is very much based on voluntary measures, and the lack of success in the implementation of these widely agreed 17 goals shows that we need mandatory means. So why I believe that the new European approach could also be beyond the EU borders helpful for SDG impact measurement and implementation is that we see already that this idea emanating from the UN guiding principles of business and human rights is kind of is popping up here and there. So even countries like South Korea, Japan, Taiwan in the Far East, and Brazil are thinking about perhaps also addressing the adverse environmental and human rights, labor rights impacts of companies in supply chains. So I think we have a very good chance by regulatory means, but also by a kind of a market dynamic that enterprises create for themselves in this situation, that we will have a more universal application of this principle. And I would say that probably, in my view, could be the biggest single instrument that could be at disposal for the real implementation of the SDGs. Also because it forces the companies really to identify the issues that they may have in their supply chains. It obliges them to put in place grievance mechanisms. Also in the European legislation, now there is civil liability. So any serious adverse impacts that the company is causing or contributing to or is directly linked to can lead to civil liability. So I would say that finally there is legislation on corporate accountability which has teeth. Of course, everything depends on the implementation, so that we don't know yet. Last week, the European Parliament finally adopted its position on the compromise that had been kind of negotiated with the Council. And we all said that this is the end of the beginning. So this means that we still have a whole new period opens, because this all has to be brought to reality. On sustainable finance reporting, I think it's also true what I'm reading from the report, that the EU has not fully grasped this kind of comprehensive approach to sustainability in its sustainable finance and the subsequent taxonomy. That I think it's understandable, but at the same time, I think it's also unforgettable, that unforgivable even, that this all started from climate. Yes, indeed, climate change is an existential issue for the whole planet and its people, and the most vulnerable people are in the developing countries. That's very clear. But nevertheless, the approach has not been holistic. It has only had the social dimensions introduced much later. And it remains to be seen how this can operate in the real life, where issues are related to one another. And I believe that the whole idea of the SDG framework is that we have to be able to look at different dimensions at the same time. But fortunately, I believe that on reporting, what we are seeing, maybe painfully and slowly, but it's happening, that the main, let's say, sustainability reporting standards are some sort of converging to some extent. And maybe one day we have reliable frameworks which are not so far from each other, which of course would be much easier than to compare the reporting of different actors. So I think this has been one of the main achievements in the last times. And I understand that the European Union's Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive is also very much a part of this tendency, and we have to make sure that this indeed happens. So yes, SDGs are still the goals that we have to reach, but we have to think about innovative means. And also, I believe that the new European legislation on supply chains and their environmental and human rights, labor rights impacts can be an important part of the implementation and really means to reach those goals. So I'm curious to hear how you see all these latest developments in the background of this badly needed acceleration of sustainable finance for reaching the SDGs. So I would leave it to that. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Heidi, for this overview and also on your comments on the various processes that are ongoing at European level and clearly outlining also where there's still need for improvement. And I think we are going to come back to that also in the discussion. I would like to hand over the floor now to Ulrike, and you're going to talk in detail about how the provisions under EU legislation are seen by civil society, and where there's room for improvement, in particular also the last point that Heidi has been mentioning, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. So Ulrike, just to as a word of introduction also for you, you have been a policy officer for sustainable finance with SÜDWIND since September 2020, and before you have ample experience with working for private financial institutions and for credit rating agencies. For 10 years, you have been working for Oikocredit, which is a cooperative that promotes sustainable development by providing loans, investments, but also by providing capacity development for partners. And before that, you have been with EMOC Rating Agency as a researcher. And finally, you have been studying in Cologne, not very far away from Aachen, where Misereor is located, and you hold a degree on regional research in Latin America. So over to you, Ulrike. We are very curious to hear what's in the report and what you have to tell us.
Well, thank you very much, Klaus, for your kind introduction. I have prepared a short slide presentation, which I will try to share with you. So, yeah, we should. Are you able to see it now?
We are seeing it, but not in the presentation mode.
Okay. Are you seeing it now in the presentation mode?
No.
Oh,
Still.
darn. I think we should have practiced should be better practiced by now, but okay. Can you see it now?
Maybe you start again.
Okay.
Otherwise,
we'll try. Okay, here we go.
Excellent.
Is this better? Great.
Yes.
Well, so the reason why we embarked on this project is that having been a researcher on sustainable investment and also following the developments in the EU on sustainable investments, what we see is that many companies and many investors really want to give their best and do better and become more sustainable. But what we also see is that there's a lot of free riding developments, and that some of the investors have been using the SDGs not for as a tool of sustainable investments, but they have been using it for window dressing. And we tried to figure a bit out how they do that and how they can do better, and how politics can help via regulation to make it more clear for investors and also for companies to how they can help to achieve the SDGs. So can we go to the second? Yes, second slide. So for those not familiar with the SDG Sustainable Finance Framework, it consists of different parts that are connected together, and I'm not going to bore you with everything, but the most important parts are the taxonomy regulation, where Heidi already mentioned, that is focusing on climate and not so much on social issues. We also have the Sustainability Disclosure Regulation, CSRD, which requires companies to report on sustainability issues. And we also, fortunately, which is not mentioned here, by now have this SDD, which was just last week passed by the by the European Parliament, and will now come into force. And it was already mentioned that the sustainable goals are sort of part of the agenda of the European Green Deal and of the sustainability investment framework. But what we have found is that they are often mentioned initially, but they are not part of the DNA. And that's a shame, because the SDGs are the most holistic piece of looking on how countries and companies and we as civil society as a whole can strive to make the world a better place. So we have the 17 goals, which are interconnected and not only look at the human rights, but also on nature. And they don't only look on minimum targets, but they also strive to make the world a more comparable in a more peaceful way. So this is why we think it's a good way to look at investments, not only focus on the E, S, and G, but also focus on how they are interconnected, and how if you advance one thing, it might have an adverse impact on the other thing. Klaus already mentioned it. The agenda is on midterm. It's a sad story. Only 12% of the goals are on track. And in order to meet the SDGs, we need massive investments. An older figure says that 2.5 trillion of US dollars need to be invested annually in the fulfillment of the SDGs, which would be 3.75% globally of globally managed private assets. That's not a whole lot, but it's not happening. One of the main problems is that we have SDG reporting, but the SDG reporting was developed for countries who regularly report on the 17 goals, on 169 targets, and of that you have sub-indicators, which are almost 250. For companies, there's no indicator set which would similarly give guidance. There are a couple of voluntary guidelines by UN bodies who have been developed, but they're hardly being used. Nevertheless, the majority of companies, of the global companies, biggest global companies, report on the SDGs, but the quality of reporting varies considerably, and the data is not comparable at all. And I will show you how that looks and what's the problem. But before we have a look on that, we have 3 SDGs where companies can have a special impact on, which is SDG 8, decent work and sustainable economic growth. It's SDG 9, industry, innovation and infrastructure, and also SDG 12, sustainable consumption and production. Those are the most inherent SDGs that companies need to have a look for, because the countries by themselves will not be able to achieve the SDGs without companies helping to achieve them. But what's happening is that at the moment, companies mostly report on what they think the SDGs are and what suits them best. For example, we looked at some of the biggest chemical companies in the world, which is BASF, Dow, Bayer, and SABIC. And all 4 of them have a declaration of support of the SDGs. Out of those 4, only 3 report on the SDGs. SABIC, for example, only says that they adhere to them, that they like them, and that's it. But then if you look at which SDG each company thinks is the ones that are important to them, and what they think where they can help to achieve the SDGs, you see that this already varies. BASF says that they for them it's key the SDG 2, 6, 7 and 8, 12 and 13, but Bayer, for example, only has 1, 2, and 5 and 6, but they don't talk about SDG 8, which is decent work. So it doesn't really make sense. And if you go to, well, I don't know if you can see that, but anyhow, you can read it in my report. If you go to the reporting on how they impact on the special SDG, BASF, for example, said that they impact positively on the SDGs by growing faster than their peers, which has nothing to do really with the SDGs, but that's how they use it for the impact reporting. And so it goes on and on and on. And but it doesn't stop with the companies. It goes on with the investors, who have very few data, and it doesn't really it's not really comparable, but the investors still report on it. So we have some figures saying that the global impact investments are somewhere between $1 or $2 trillion annually. But we don't really know where that investment goes to. And another problem is that those figures usually don't make a distinction between impact orientation, which is saying which SDG you're trying to reach, and impact effectiveness, which is reporting on how you really helped and achieved some positive impacts. For the German speakers in the German market, the SDG impact is a lot smaller. It's less than 10% of the German market. Impact investments in 2022 were about 40 billion. And unfortunately, I don't have the figures for the German market, but if you look at the SDGs that investors reported that they were focusing on in their investments, you see pretty much only the usual ESG scope, which is renewable energy, which is climate change, and which is healthcare. But we don't see as much are the SDGs that are not on track, which is zero hunger, which is a good education system. Those are not as important. And the reason is that investors don't look at the SDGs that need more investment. They look at what they have and where they would like to invest, and then they match it afterwards. Many of the investors use SDG ratings, and one of the main issues that we have with it, that they are not transparent. Investors use SDG ratings, but they use it. They use their own proprietary data. They don't give information which data they have, which we already saw on the company reporting. It's not very good. And they don't give any information on how they operationalize the SDGs impact reporting. So it's no wonder that the SDG ratings of the 4 biggest providers only match by 30 to 50%. For example, the SDG rating of Bayer with MSCI is -3, and with ISS it's plus 2.5. And we don't really know what that means. We only know one is negative, one is positive, but we don't know what kind of impact it makes. So for outsiders who are not working in it and who don't have access to the proprietary data, you can only rely on the nice figure, on the nice SDGs pictures, and that's not good enough. I already mentioned on the problems that the data is not comparable, but another problem is that companies usually don't give information on their investments and their presence per country. So if an investment would like to invest in the countries of the global south via big companies, they don't have access to the information what the company does in which country and where investments are being done. There's no matching with the SDGs that are not on target, and all in all, there's very little investment in countries of the global south. Investors do have possibilities for targeted investments. They can do that either through special SDG bonds, which are very comparable to green bonds or social bonds or sustainable bonds, but they do have an SDG focus. And there are some countries of the global south who have emitted SDG bonds, and they're much more targeted, but they're not company investments, they're country investments. There are some companies who make a positive contribution and who do disclose their activities in the global south. That's usually extra information that is not part of the normal ESG package, but it can be found, and it can be either research in-house or it can be bought. There are green, social, or sustainability bonds with a focus on the global south. Company operating in the global south who emits a green bond is a very good possibility. And there's also the classic impact products, such as blended finance or providers specializing in sustainable business in the global south. And one of the possibilities which will need much improvement, which I will show where the improvement is needed, investors can use the data for where there are or will be comparable SDG-related indicators, either via the Global Reporting Initiative data, the GRI, or by the ERSS, the indicators that are part of the CSRD. The disclosure requirement for sustainable funds are also part of the sustainable finance package, and funds nowadays already have to disclose if they have sustainability features, if they want to be an Article 8 fund and be sustainable. If they want to be an Article 9 fund, they additionally have to show an aim to achieve an environmental and social objective. And they may do that with either SDG data, but they could also focus on specialist how they do that via the CSRD. So if we look at the CSRD, which is already in place, so companies starting next year will have to report on their corporate sustainability impacts. The problem is that at the moment, the reporting requirements, which are the ESRS, are only defined on a general basis. So it's the set 1, but the set 2 on a sector basis has not been established yet in it, and it has been delayed by 2 years. So we will have to wait until we get data on that. And one of the big achievements of the CSRD is that it is based on the principle of dual materiality. So companies don't only look on the outside in perspective, but also on the inside out perspective. What is their impact on the environment, on human rights, on the planet? The SDGs are partially included in the ESRS, but not all the SDGs are included, and they are not holistically included, and that's a problem. We don't have much time, so I will not go through this by length, but relate a bit on what is missing. One of the main issues that NGOs are having with the CSRD is that the majority of the reporting requirements are dependent on an in-house materiality analysis of the companies. So if a company declares human rights for being non-material for them, they will not have to report on it. And the future will show how good or bad reporting is, but I think it's up to the next EU Commission and Parliament to have a good look at companies' reporting and see that they don't underreport by misusing the materiality analysis. Another main issue that we're having is that not all SDGs are covered, especially the most important SDGs, like no poverty, no hunger, no education, are not being covered by the ESRS, and that's a lack, because if what doesn't get measured doesn't get managed. So key aspects are missing, and one other key aspect that that is missing that I mentioned before is that we don't have disaggregated per country information. So it's hard to see if a company says it targets SDG 7, if the money flows into those countries that need the investments and not where the investments always flow into. And there's no target set for the SDGs where the targets are missed. So that's another thing that the next EU bodies should look into. I come to my recommendations. The first set of recommendations goes to the companies. The companies must recognize and systematically embed their impact based on the SDGs. They shouldn't do SDG mapping by deciding what suits them best, but they should do SDG reporting based on comparable, recognized, and transparent indicators. And they also should include not only positive aspects, but also negative aspects, because there always are positive and negative aspects. And it doesn't really help to say we positively impact on 2, 9, and 7, and then being silent about what might not work so well. And they should prioritize SDG with particular relevance in comparison with the SDGs that are in danger of being missed. Companies should define targets, they should do monitoring and reporting, and they need to report broken down by country. And they should not only report on the ESRS which they find material, but they should report on all ESRS that relate to the SDGs and where possible and relevant also on the GRI. Investors, first of all, should make their SDG ratings transparent. They should make transparent the data they use, the calculation basis, and the weighting, the operationing. They should use standard data. For example, they should start with the ESRS, the GRIs, and other indicators where possible. They should steer their investment towards the SDGs where the targets are missed. And they can also already use targeted investments such as SDG bonds or green social or sustainability bonds with the SDGs reference in ES countries. They could also or should define their engagement based on SDG goals. But that's for another project to elaborate on. We also have recommendation for political decision makers. The EU should, working on this sustainable finance framework, they should operationalize the SDGs better and include them in a more targeted manner. The ESRS need to be mandatory on the ESRS with SDG reference. We need to adapt a taxonomy regulation that includes social criteria and is matched and mapped with the SDGs, because the taxonomy is a regulation is the heart of the sustainable finance framework. And if we only measure the or tax the environmental and the climate part, we cannot measure. We cannot really invest and target the social dimension. On a global on the global side, the ISSB needs to adapt the double materiality principle. They need to include more social criteria, and they need to do a systematic mapping of the SDGs. And last not least, we also have recommendations for the United Nations. I know we're just a small NGO, but we do have big wishes. We need to reform the SDG reporting for companies. We need guidelines, and they should come from the UN. Maybe not now, but there will be a follow-up of the SDGs, and it is very important to have guidelines if you want companies there. You need a global guideline for all of them. We need binding implementation for these guidelines and the reporting. And in the revision of the SDGs, we need to resolve some of the contradictions. We need to talk more about the planetary boundaries and how the human rights must not be damaged at the expense of economic growth. So with this, I close my presentation, and I already see that in the chat.
Yes,
Okay.
well, thank you, Ulrike, for that presentation of the study and your recommendations. Very comprehensive overview. I particularly liked your last point when you ended with recommendations also for the UN member states, because this is where I started off, and I can very strongly underline this. And just as a comment from my side, next year in 2025, we will have the 4th UN Financing for Development Conference, and that is in particular the place where the UN member states look at global financial architecture reforms. And I take that, some of the issues that you've been talking about also address the need for regulation at the UN level, including that on a binding treaty on business human rights, so which would be the logical extension to the EU CSDD that we now see being adopted. Yes, indeed, we have a couple of questions from Antje Schneeweiss on your presentation. But first of all, Heidi, if you are still with us, yes, you are. I would like to give the word back to you in order to react on what Ulrike has been saying. I mean, you have been underlying very strongly that we need more mandatory reporting and regulation of the private sector if we would see better outcomes for SDG investments. So, that I think strongly resonates with what you've been saying. So first, over to you. Maybe also what can we expect after the EU elections? Ulrike also mentioned a few projects that need to be picked up again after elections.
Yeah, thank you very much indeed also for Ulrike for the presentation of the report. So I'm just thinking about this very difficult situation that, as Ulrike, you mentioned that sustainable investments in the global south are really lacking. And what could be done? So I would say that there is a new trend in the EU regulation. There's a certain thing called a Sustainable Investment Facilitation Agreement. And the first has been struck with Angola. And of course, everybody thinks about oil when you think about Angola. But the idea is precisely to divert the investments to other sectors, to diversify investments. So Angola will not be as dependent on exporting oil. So there has been discussion that this kind of sustainable investment facilitation agreements could be, for instance, brought to the West African countries that are major exporters of cocoa to the EU. As you know, Ghana, Cote d'Ivoire, and maybe Cameroon. So the idea is to help the countries to put in place, let's say, an enabling sustainable business environment. And on the other hand, when you have obligations to EU companies and companies operating in Europe on making sure that they don't have adverse impacts on human rights and environment in their value chains or supply chains rather. So I think if these two would meet, then perhaps this could help to promote sustainable investment in the global south. So there are new instruments that are coming, which are very much now, I would say, also linked to EU trade policy. And if I can sort of perceive one major change in the past 5 years of the EU legislative cycle, that is that finally, sustainable development and trade have been sort of brought more closely together. So I see promising signs that the EU is kind of able to handle the various dimensions of these problems at the same time in one picture. I hope this continues. And if I may then say after the elections, as everybody has seen now, the Green Deal has become a kind of a battleground. And, it's some say that too much, too soon, now we have to at least take a pause. But I do believe that progressive companies are growing in numbers. And I don't think they would be very, let's say, happy if the EU decision makers would now somehow let's say, make a kind of a U-turn, that this Green Deal didn't mean anything. So I don't think it's possible anymore, but maybe I'm too optimistic, but that's my view. So the politicians will try, they will definitely try. And also there's a lot of pressure on Ursula von der Leyen, who's now aspiring for her second term as Commission's president, that to sort of temper a little bit her green commitments, which I would say have been surprising. And I don't have to say that the Greens were very surprised about her commitment, and we believe that we have to sort of defend her ideas. But it is a kind of the elections are always a moment to consider these things. So we'll have to see. But as you know, the elections are still, they are free and fair in 27 EU member states. So we shouldn't make any decisive forecasts on how this will end. But at least the elections are an opportunity for those in the civil society, in the corporate world, and among political parties to defend let's say the continuation and further evolution of the Green Deal, also including its external and development dimension. So I don't think I can say anything more about the elections now.
Well, thank you. Well, I think we all share your optimism in that, in the future there will be further developments towards more better and more efficient regulation of companies towards the fulfillment of the SDGs. But still in Germany, and I think it's true for other European member countries, we observe a great deal of regulation fatigue, both from companies as from the policymakers, right? So it's increasingly hard to get ambitious regulations through, and we've seen that in the final battle, if you like, around the CSDD, which was from the civil society point of view substantially watered down. We've seen that in the lack of comprehensive inclusion of financial sector in the CSDD. So what makes you so optimistic that with a new parliament where we can expect a more right-leaning, political spectrum in Brussels, that we were able to have more comprehensive legislation?
Maybe just one attempt to justify the optimism. First of all, this final game on the CSDD, which took 3 months after the trilogue agreement between the Council and the Parliament had already been made. So it was dramatic, and I think it's worrying that the member states especially, they start to sort of open the agreements that have been struck, because this kind of challenges the whole legitimacy of the EU legislative procedures. But fortunately, the due diligence process, which is really at the heart, and the civil liability, remained intact in this horse trading that Germany, Italy, France, and some smaller member states, also Finland, open. So I think we can be happy about what we have, and now the question is the implementation, really. But I have never ever seen any legislative instrument in the EU which would have gotten so much support from so many different actors, especially when it was in danger. We had all these statements from UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, from UN Global Compact, to groups of companies, civil society. So it's really massive. And I think this, even in that sense, it was history becoming real. So I'm sure there will be many researchers who will look into what actually happened. But the best thing is that the due diligence as defined in UNGP on business and human rights remained largely intact. I could list a few deficiencies which were there from the beginning, and which the Council and the Parliament already watered down. But I would say it's still there, and it's the first time that such a mandatory instrument has been put in place. And as I said, I believe that there will be positive spillover effects. Also negative, because you have seen that some of these laws, like the deforestation regulation, has actually faced quite a lot of resistance in the, let's say, the more impactful, more powerful countries like Brazil and Indonesia. So that's something that the EU diplomats have to deal with, and maybe others as well. And I think it is largely true that some of these instruments have been put in place without proper voice to be given to the countries which are then, let's say, at least targeted in a sense. So, but the main thing is now that companies understand that they have also to somehow level the playing field, and the EU has, and its member states have to put its development instruments into the implementation to help the producer countries to make sure that the smallholders are not sidelined from the supply chains. That has been mentioned, and I believe that's the main challenge. But yeah. So can I just say one more thing, which because Ulrike mentioned that some of these reporting systems do not address all SDGs, but at least I can say that poverty is a part of the CSDDD, because it brings the question of living wage and decent living pay, living income to the questions of the material impacts of the companies. This is a very tough nut. We know it. I know it very well from the cocoa sector that I've been involved in for some years, but it is there. So I would say that indirectly, this instrument also has to do with eradication of poverty.
Very well, thank you. Ulrike, basically the same question over to you as a way of introduction. Regulation fatigue. I mean, you've been talking a lot about the deficiencies of the regulatory frameworks we see at the European level up to this moment. In particular, the European sustainability reporting standards. They need to be better, more targeted, country disaggregated, if I understand you correctly. So what makes you optimistic that we will see more progress after the elections, that is in all the areas that you've been outlining in the recommendations? And then also, if you may want to turn to the questions that Antje Schneeweiss put in the Q&A, which are of a bit more detailed technical nature, I would invite you to also address that.
Well, thank you very much, Klaus. First of all, I would like to just add one thing to what Heidi just said, with the CSDDD being a very important piece and being a starting point, which is true. But there's one thing that unfortunately is missing in CSDDD, which is the financial sector. And this is, we all know, it was not the wish of the Greens, and it was not the wish of many member states to exclude the financial sector. But this is one of the main challenges, I think, because we have the financial sectors now being obliged to be more transparent about their investment, but they don't have minimum standards, and they don't have requirements to comply with those standards. So this is something where I put my hope in for the next for after the elections, that we do have a review clause in that CSDD. And my hope is that after 2 years, the Commission will take up again this regulation and finally include the financial sector, because yes, they are not directly active in countries such as Ghana. They are not on the ground buying cocoa, but they're the ones who funnel the investments toward economic activities, and it's up to them to invest in things or not to invest in them. So that's one of my hopes, that the CSDD will be picked up. And as on regulation fatigue, yes, I've heard a lot of regulation fatigue, and in part I do understand investors. It has been very hard times for them, because those regulations are coming not at the same pace. So they do have reporting requirements for some information that is not really there yet. They want to do better, but they can't. They have the taxonomy, but social investors, for example, can't really use it because it's only on greens. So I see that it's not satisfactory for investors yet, but what I think is that a lot of it will settle once this CSRD requirements are in place and we have better data. And I also think that many of them just have to get used to it, and they have to implement the regulation and into their daily business. And I think a lot of the battle was trying to not have it at all. And once it's there, it's not going to be as hard of a deal as it was. And I think from there, we will have to see where we can adjust, maybe make some things a bit more easy, also on the reporting requirements, but then also look at what is missing as for the social dimension. So taking a look at the questions, Antje, you asked about the 71% of companies. Does this mean listed companies? Yes, that was a research done on, I think it was 8,000 companies, listed companies, so the biggest companies worldwide. And that was a representative research done. The second question is, you wonder whether companies have to report on human rights because the PI 10 and 11 are demanding it, and data necessary for the PI are supposed to be mandatory. Yeah, good question. It might be a good way to do that, but it shouldn't be the only way to go via the PI, because the PI only are principal adverse impacts, and there we're again at minimum standards, and the worst that's not happening. But I think we shouldn't only frame the human rights on not having slave labor and not having child labor, but we should look on it on a more holistic side and also have living wage included, and that's not part of the PI. And the last question is, the ESRS will provide us with many new information on social topics from the EU companies. So for you, the question is how this data can be used to evaluate the social impact of a company. That's up for further research. I think it all depends on or how this data can be used in a real on real world terms. It depends on how many companies report and how many of them will say that it's not material for them, and then there will be no data. If many companies report on ESRS relating to social issues, I think it will be a very powerful tool for investors to better target their investment towards social dimensions. But still, we're missing a social taxonomy that defines EU-wide on what our on what our society wants to see as social investments and social positive contribution, not only in the EU, but also on a global basis.
Thank you, Ulrike, also for addressing the questions. And I think we have a bit of time just for a last round of questions. So I encourage the audience to put any questions in the chat. Otherwise, I will also hand over to Heidi and Ulrike for final remarks. Heidi, you have been mentioning yourself that the progress is painfully slow, and this is something I heard when we look at the various processes underway. In particular, we have been missing the opportunity for a social taxonomy, which would guide investors to where more sustainable ways of investments can be found. We are missing the bits and pieces on mandatory and binding due diligence legislation for the financial sector, as Ulrike has been saying lately. So I would assume that the Greens in particular would be pushing these issues in the new parliament. But you know, what is your take on that? Final remarks.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, on the finance sector, what the agreed outcome now says is that there is a specific review for financial sector. Report by the Commission is expected no later than 2 years after the entry into the force, and there will be the possibility to put forward a legislative proposal in view of the further inclusion of the financial sector. Well, we all know very well that there was no unanimity between the member states on whether to include financial sector or not. It was the mighty France as a big member state who managed to delete it completely already when the original trilogue agreement was made. But you saw, for instance, that all the Nordic finance, finance organizations representing the finance sector, they were all in favor of having the finance sector in, and big Dutch banks were also very much promoting inclusion of the finance sector. So, it's very unfortunate, but it shows that there is a trend, and I think in that sense one can be optimistic that at latest this review will bring the finance sector in the scope of the CSDD. And as we know, there is, and as I said in my introductory remarks, that there is also, apart from the regulatory measures, there is a kind of a market dynamic. So companies are learning and they are practicing this, even if they don't have to, because it's their stakeholders, their clients, their investors, and so on require it. So I think trend is promising. And then on this regulatory fatigue, I agree with Ulrike that part of it is a kind of a, let's say, a question of getting used. But I like to think that in order to learn new ways of examining sustainability in its total screen, SDGs, 17 of them, and all the different dimensions that we discuss now in the CSDD, it takes a bit unlearning from old bad habits, and then new way of looking at things can grow. And it takes a kind of a change in the corporate culture. You cannot do it if this sort of new way of holistic thinking of sustainability and awareness of the dual materiality, if it does not reach to the very top level of the company and organization. So this was, of course, one of the disputed things, that even if the Commission was very much insisting that there should be also requirements for organizations to sort of adapt their business models. But then even in the parliament it was difficult, but especially among the member states. So this whole corporate governance vis-a-vis sustainability still remains to be tackled. And there are some ideas that maybe in the next term there could be some even models from, I would say, France, the Netherlands, to be mentioned, who have already kind of adapted their corporate governance rules on sustainability, so that it is not just shareholder rights. And I'm sure there will be a new wave of EU shareholder rights legislation, which is an opportunity. So I see this as a kind of among the next challenges. Apart from what I need to underline, that implementing the CSDD and to make sure that it is somehow working hand in hand with the new requirements on reporting is a lot to do. So there will be a lot of work for all of us, I guess.
Well, thank you, Heidi. And for concluding, then I would hand over again to Ulrike. Clearly, there are a lot of carrots out for companies, but we have been focusing about the sticks that are also needed in order to advance actually progress. Okay, Ulrike, over to you.
Famous last words. Yeah, I agree with Heidi. There remains a lot of work to be done, and I think we shouldn't be discouraged by the hard battles that had been fought. But look forward to what's coming next, and I think in history we've seen that history strives forward, not backwards. So I hope that in 5 years from now we'll meet and talk about how the next European bodies have improved and the sustainability reporting and also due diligence measures, so that we will not talk about how the SDGs were missed, but how in the end it will have ended all good, and that they are on track also because of European investments focusing in the global south. So
well, thanks for that optimistic view to start us off in the new week. Thanks to Heidi Hautala for taking your time to discuss very interesting comments. And thank you very much to Ulrike for presenting the study and all of those who joined us this morning. So have a good week, and I think we will revisit all of what we've been talking about rather soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Bye.